This video and all of its contents, including any opinions expressed by the narrator, are strictly for entertainment purposes only and is not intended in any way as a substitute for professional services and consultation from a licensed therapist, doctor, attorney, or other licensed professional service provider. Each person must make their own life decisions, and those decisions are theirs. Welcome back to Find Your Alpha, your favorite channel on YouTube. Today we've got another great story for you, and there's some themes I want to have you watch out for in this story. The first one, virginity does not guarantee loyalty. The next one, never ever fight over a cheating partner. The next one, cheating is relationship treason. And finally, karma eventually bites back twice as hard. Now, let's get into today's story. And you can see the title coming up on your screen. My husband impregnated my AP's wife, and an AP stands for affair partner. This story dates back to May of 2016. She starts off by saying, I was referred here by my sister, who thought getting opinions of people not familiar with my situation could benefit me. I'm a 31 female. For this posting, call me Gina. And my husband, Greg, 33 male. We've been married for 10 years and together nearly 13. We have 2 children, a girl 9 and a boy 8. Greg is the only man I had been with prior to my affair, while Greg had 3 previous girlfriends prior to dating me. We had a great marriage full of love, laughter, and family. Though we had been married for a number of years, our intimacy was completely fulfilling for me, and I believe it was for Greg too. Now, for the part where I ruined everything. I met a man, call him Rich, at my daughter's soccer practice. He was a parent of a 6-year-old girl who was playing in the league below my daughter. He worked from home and was able to attend soccer practice and games. Initially, I spoke to him as part of a group of parents as we stood on the sidelines watching our children. The only reason he stood out is he was one of the few dads that were there during practices, which normally took place just after school. Eventually, we started talking more frequently, and then I noticed he would always come right over and stand near me at every practice, even when I was with other mothers. These chats led to an uncomfortable conversation where he told me he had strong feelings for me. I clearly told him I was happily married and we'd have discontinue speaking. With this, he backed off. While I rebuffed his advances, for some reason, I liked the attention. There's that attention and validation that pretty much all women are always looking for. And she's falling for it here, as you can see with this guy. I know it was so wrong now, but I want to be honest here and tell you what I was feeling. Eventually, he brought his feelings up again and asked if I'd meet him for coffee at a shop in the next town over. At first, I told him no, but then decided to meet with him, making it clear it would only be this one meeting for coffee and nothing more. I know now just talking to him was cheating and totally disrespecting my husband and family, but I couldn't stop it. At the end of our private meeting, before we left to go to our children's practice, he told me he wanted me to come to his house tomorrow at the same time. He gave me a piece of paper with his home address. I said, no, I can't. But with that, he gently kissed me. And I'm ashamed to say, not only did I kiss him back, I kissed him again when he pulled away. Oh my goodness, these are 2 nasty, grimy people. The next day, we met at his house and had S. Just like that, she meets at his house and they do the deed. There was no talking before or build up. We just did it. As I looked around and saw photos of his beautiful wife and child, I became so upset with myself. I started thinking about Greg and my kids and burst out crying, telling Rich I couldn't do this again. We cleaned up, got dressed, and left in our cars for practice. For the next week, I avoided Rich at soccer practice, and when I did eventually speak to him again, I told him I didn't want to see or speak to him ever again. With this, he handed me a note with the name and address of a hotel in the same neighboring town. He said he wanted me to meet him there tomorrow at our special time, but would understand if I didn't come. I just told him, no, no, I can't, and then I left. That night, I stayed up all night thinking about this situation and how it would destroy my marriage and family if this ever became known. But foolishly, I thought it was unlikely as we never called or texted, and all of our communications were verbal or via these handwritten notes. You see how sneaky and underhanded people can be when they're cheating? If they keep it on the down low like this, a person may never find out unless they slip up, which you're going to see these people do. My intention was not to go, but I broke down and did. Again, as with our first meeting, it ended with me crying and telling Rich we cannot do this again. This time he agreed with me, but said our lovemaking was worth the risk. We parted and this time remained apart for a full month with no contact, outside of brief conversations at soccer practice and at games while talking with other parents. What's most disturbing is that at one of the games, now listen to this is disturbing. My husband Greg and Rich ended up talking for over 20 minutes. This made me feel terrible, but in a way, it excited me in some twisted reason. Ma'am, you are a sicko if that excited you. You are a sick person. Fast forward to my D-Day, the day my husband discovered my affair, and the absolute worst day of my life, she says, already crying. Rich and I spoke at soccer practice the day before and agreed we can no longer meet as we were both happily married and loved our spouses and children. If you're cheating on your husband and he's cheating on his wife, you are not happily married. And guess what? You do not love or respect your spouses. That is just bunk. However, and here's where I made a really bad mistake, we agreed to meet one final time. I know people on here are not going to believe me, but it's true. D-Day was to be our final time. I don't believe you. I can tell you that right now. That was not going to be your final time. The only reason why it was your final time is because, as you're going to see here, she gets busted. I didn't want to meet at Rich's house as I couldn't take seeing the photos of his wife and child, so I offered to have him meet me at my home. The plan was for him to park on the adjacent street and walk over to my house, then walk up to the side door where I would let him in. It was slightly raining and no one was out on the street, so I thought he did so undetected. You see again how much planning goes into these affairs. When people lie and they say, oh, it just happened on the spur of the moment, we just did it, because we kind of ran into each other. No, all of these affairs, you'll find out if you really dig deeper, are really well planned out trysts. And no one can get away by saying, oh, it just happened. No, it didn't happen. It was a calculated decision. I took him to our home office on the second floor, which has a guest bed, and that is where we got together. I want to say I would have never done anything in our marital bed like we did at Rich's house, as I have too much love and respect for my husband. Really, lady, you have the nerve to say that and write that? Unbelievable. Since this was going to be our last time, there was a lot of kissing and foreplay before the actual act. Just as we began, my husband, Greg, came into the room, and stood beside the bed recording. I don't know how long he had been there before he said, "What the HELL is going on here?" With this, Rich and I quickly separated, and I just started crying, telling Greg I'm sorry and could explain everything. Explain what, she says, I don't know, but at the time it was all I could think to say. And in a lot of these stories, you'll hear that's one of the first things that people say if they are busted cheating. Oh, I can explain everything, even though they're there, naked with another person. And that is just a defense mechanism to buy time. They don't have anything to explain. What are they going to explain? This is crazy. I don't know what got into Rich, but he completely panicked and tried to push past Greg, who was blocking the door. Greg is over 6 feet tall and weighs nearly 230, while Rich is only about 5'10 and weighs about 160. So he bounced off Greg, falling back to the floor. He got up again and attempted to charge at Greg, but this time Greg stepped forward and pushed him back hard. Now listen to what happens next. The push sent Rich flying back, where he hit one of the window screens and fell backwards out the window, landing on a large juniper-type bush we have in front of the house. He was completely naked. I cried and begged Greg to stop, as he was going to hurt Rich, and I didn't want him, Greg, to get in trouble. With this, Greg just gave me a mean look and ran down the stairs. I was afraid he was going to beat Rich and was so fearful my husband would get in trouble with the law. I watched from the window wrapped in a comforter and saw Rich still laying naked in the bush, trying to extract himself. I could see he was scratched up and bleeding, but didn't appear seriously injured. Now, we're at a point in this story where I want to encourage you, if you're liking what you hear, hit that like button. That will get this video seen by people all over the world. Now, let's go on with our story. Greg emerged from the house holding Rich's cell phone and started shouting at Rich to give him his passcode. Rich started begging for mercy, pleading with Greg not to hurt him and not to call his wife Kate. Greg got angry and told Rich to give me the effing code or you're going to suffer. With this, Rich quickly gave him the code and Greg entered it into the phone. Greg then called Kate and told her who he was and explained that he was standing here with her naked husband, who he just caught having S with his wife. After some additional back and forth and comforting talk, he gave Kate our address and ended the call. I then saw our next door neighbor walking over. He asked Greg if everything was all right. Greg told him no, but said he'd be okay. Greg then thanked him for calling him and explained he caught us in the act. Our neighbor said he knew something was up when he saw a man sneaking around outside the house. He said at first he thought he was robbing the place until he saw me answer the door and let him in. The neighbor told Greg he just had to call me. Well, Greg, you need to buy that guy a beer, or better yet, buy him dinner, or better yet, buy him a huge gift certificate, because he saved you a lot of grief and future aggravation. Greg told the neighbor he was going to call the police as he wanted to report the situation. Hearing this, Rich began crying and pleaded with Greg not to do so. At this point, he was still naked and had began shaking violently. I shouted down to Greg asking him to please not call the police, but he ignored us and called. The police came within a few minutes. Greg and our neighbor met the officer out at the curb, where they spoke for several minutes, pointing to the neighbor's house and then up to the office window. They next walked up to the bush where Rich was hunched over, crying and naked. This Rich is just an emotional basket case. The officer asked Greg if he could retrieve his clothes, and Greg said he would do so. When I heard Greg open the door, I ran to the top of the steps crying and telling him how sorry I was and how much I loved him, but he never looked up. He just gathered Rich's clothes and shoes off the floor and stairs and went back outside. The officer took the clothes from Greg and handed them to Rich, and he clumsily got dressed. Rich was hyperventilating and still violently shaking at this point. I had never seen anyone do this and realized it was probably from a combination of nervous fear, shock, and from being cold, as it was only about 55 degrees. I stood at the window while the officer questioned Rich, but they couldn't see me because of the screens we have on our windows. He told Rich to settle down and relax, which he eventually did. Rich said it was all his fault and he deserved it. He explained truthfully what happened and said he charged at Greg, as he just wanted to get out of there. The officer asked him if Greg acted defensively or offensively when he pushed him. Rich replied that it was defensively. I was relieved Rich didn't falsely accuse Greg. Soon a number of neighbors gathered out front. The neighbor who reported me to Greg was explaining to them what was going on. I was so embarrassed and just cried harder. Now back to the police officer and Rich. The officer asked him if he wanted to press charges. Rich said he didn't and said he just wanted to leave and promised to never bother our family again. After this, Rich's wife Kate pulled up out front. My husband walked out to greet her, where they spoke for a minute or so. Rich ran over to her crying and saying he was sorry, but she didn't acknowledge him. The officer spoke to her, and I could faintly hear her say she wanted Rich to stay away from her. The officer then told Rich to step back, and he did and started ugly crying. The officer spoke to Greg and Kate for a few minutes, then walked into the house to speak to me. He called up the stairs and asked if I could come down and talk with him. I said okay, but asked him to give me a minute or so to get dressed. The officer then took my statement. At the end of our conversation, he said that my husband requested I voluntarily leave the home. I told the officer I didn't want to, and that I needed to speak with my husband. He said he understood, but explained it would be best if I left at least for tonight, so things could calm down. I cried, and he asked if there was anyone I could call, and I told him yes, my parents. No sooner did I say this, I heard my mom on the porch talking to Greg. When I saw her face, I just said, "Mom, I'm sorry, I really messed up bad." The officer explained to Mom that it would be best for me to stay with her for a few days until things settled down. I then went upstairs with Mom to pack. She didn't say anything while I packed, but I knew she was angry, embarrassed, and really disappointed with me. When Mom and I came downstairs and walked outside, only the officer was there along with several neighbors who were still out on the sidewalk talking. The officer explained that Greg had gone to pick up the kids at school and would be taking them to practice, then out to eat. He said Greg asked that I close and lock the door, and he, Greg, would call me in a few days to talk. When I got back to my parents' house, both Mom and Dad scolded me for destroying my marriage. I just said I was sorry and explained that I was going to win back Greg's trust. My dad told me that was never going to happen and that I should just start preparing for divorce. With this, I burst out crying, and Mom asked him why he'd say something like that. He just said, "Because it's true, and that's because your dad obviously is a strong man, and he knows Greg is a strong man, and he knows that a strong man is not going to put up with a cheater." For the next 2 days, I texted and called Greg, but he didn't respond. Then on Wednesday evening, he sent a text stating we could meet on Saturday morning at our house to discuss next steps. He also wrote in the text that he had already explained to our kids what happened, so they were fully aware. I couldn't believe he did this without me. I thought they must hate me now. In a separate text, Greg said he filed charges against Rich and secured a 30-day TRO, a temporary restraining order. I hated hearing this, as I just wanted this nightmare to end. To make matters worse, the incident was written up in the police section of our local paper. While the paper didn't give names or our house number, it did give our street name and was written so it was obvious what happened. So now I'm sure she's the talk of the town. Saturday came and I was both excited and nervous to see Greg again. My dad and mom drove me and stayed out on the porch as Greg and I met inside. I told them they could leave, but Greg said he wanted them there as he didn't trust being alone with me. She says, sigh in parentheses. I went in to hug him and he just held up his hands, keeping me away. We sat down and he handed me separation papers. I broke down crying and told him, no, please don't do this. I pleaded and again told him how sorry I was and I loved him and only him. He just said, no, you don't, and started explaining the papers. I continued begging, but he just kept explaining how the separation will work. He said I could move back in, but would be staying in the office that was still just the way I left it. Ooh. He then said he was splitting our bank accounts 50-50 and we would split the equity in the house if it ever sold, but explained he wanted me to surrender any claim to his 401k. He then went on and explained, now listen to this, that starting next month, I would be required to contribute 35% or about $2,300 per month of our living expenses, including the mortgage, insurances, utilities, car payments, food, etc. Since I didn't have a job, I would need to pay him from my half of the savings. He explained that all of this was clearly detailed in the separation agreement and that I needed to get a lawyer to review it. I told him I don't want to get a lawyer. I just wanted to talk to him about us. He calmly but firmly said there's nothing to talk about and said he just wants to officially separate from me. He next explained that the only time he will talk to me would be for matters pertaining to our kids or when our kids are talking to both of us. He said anything else I say will be ignored. I cried and asked if he was going to divorce me, and he said, right now, that's my plan. I told him I couldn't live without him, and I will fight with everything I had to keep him. He just looked at me with disgust and started laughing loudly. With that, he yelled out to my parents to come in. He then called his parents on speakerphone and explained everything he just told me to both sets of parents. It was like a business meeting, while for me it was torture. I just apologized to Greg and our parents and said I was going to fight to save my husband and family. This all went down this morning, and now I'm here in the office writing this post at 1:44 a.m. as I can't sleep. Talking to my sister earlier, she gave me great advice and said I might also want to post here to see if any readers might offer some additional suggestions that could be helpful. So here I am. What should I do? Have I broken my marriage beyond repair? Let me just interject here and tell you, yes, you have. Is there any chance of getting the beautiful life I destroyed back, or is it gone forever? Let me tell you, it is gone forever. She says all responses, even the bad ones, are welcome. Right now, I just feel like an outcast with no one to turn to. My sister has been great, though she too is disgusted with me. Thank you in advance for reading this and for any replies you send, Gina. So that's the end of her original post. Now I'm going to read a few responses that she got from the community. And all of these responses are from women. I usually pick a combination of responses from women and men, but this time on this posting, all the responses for men were more very short and to the point, like, oh, you're nasty, oh, you're terrible, oh, I'd divorce you immediately, things like that. Where some of the women had more descriptive and I think a little better comments. And let's get to them right now. The first one says, not only have you destroyed your marriage, you have forever changed the relationship you have with your children, your parents, and everyone in the community. Something similar, though not as dramatic, happened to my sister 16 years ago. Her husband divorced her, and everyone in our small town still refers to her as the home wrecker. Good luck. Here's the second response from a woman. It says, do you know how much danger you put your husband in by bringing this strange man into his home? In the heat of the moment, your lover could have seriously hurt Greg by knocking him down, or your lover could have been seriously hurt or worse when he fell out of the window. Your husband could be facing prison time now, all because of you. You are beyond awful. And then finally, the third response here, she says, I was in your shoes 7 years ago. I know you're not going to want to hear this, but the best thing to do is to divorce. My loving husband took me back, but our marriage was never the same. He never touched me again and instead began a relationship with his now wife. He met her through the one-sided open marriage I offered him. We finally divorced 2 years ago. I wish you well. Well, two things to say about this response. Number one, never stay with a cheater. Number two, open relationships do not work. Now, here's the updates. And guess what? There's only one update, and it's a final update that she gave about 15 months later. You can see this update is from August of 2017, so about 15 months later. She says, a lot has happened in my life since I last updated. I first want to thank everyone who responded to my original post. Reading all the responses helped me keep going, even though many were very critical of my actions. I can say from experience that not every story has a happy ending. In fact, some endings are just terrible. Greg and I are now divorced. Good job, Greg. That's what you should have done because you never want to stay with a cheater. I tear up now just hearing those words, and I still can't believe it. It's just a nightmare. If you remember from my original post, my husband and I were back living together in our home, even though we were legally separated. Things were cold between us for the first month, but then he started to come around, talking to me more and even laughing and joking with me and the kids. I was feeling good about our progress and was confident we could reconcile if we kept on the path we were on. Then, out of the blue, 4 months into our separation, Greg said he wanted to talk with me alone without the kids. I thought this was going to be a discussion about us taking the next steps towards reconciliation. But instead, he told me he wanted a divorce. I was completely devastated. I know all wayward wives use that term a lot in these posts, but I can tell you I truly was. Greg explained that while he will always care deeply for me as the mother of his two beautiful children, the love, passion, and trust he had for me is gone. I tried everything to get him to change his mind, but it was already made up. I broke down and we hugged, but I could tell it was not a hug of a husband and a wife. It was more like two friends. Since we had been separated nearly 4 months and had already agreed to the division of assets and custody in the separation agreement, the divorce went quickly and was finalized in February of this year. Greg treated me fairly. He bought out my equity share in our home and even gave me an additional $10,000 as he wanted to make sure I was able to maintain a good home for our kids. Even though I had a nice sum of money from the divorce, it was not enough to buy a home, nor was it enough to live on for the rest of my life. So I ended up taking a job at a new donut franchise just down the street from our kids' school. I know the woman who owns the franchise, so I contacted her about working there, and she hired me on the spot. Contrary to what you might think, I love working there. The owner is very nice and understanding. My coworkers are awesome, and our customers are super friendly. I kind of wished I had gotten a job while I was married, as maybe things wouldn't have turned out like they have. How does the saying go? An idle mind is the devil's playground, or something like that? Oh well, I can't change the past, she says. As for Greg, a month after our divorce was final, now this is where I think Greg made a mistake. He announced to his family and friends that he and Kate were officially a couple and were expecting a child in August. I ended up finding out through my kids, who were excited about having two new siblings, the new baby and Kate's daughter. This news absolutely destroyed me. I just couldn't believe Greg would do this and then not tell me about it himself. It's obvious Greg and Kate were seeing each other while we were separated. In fact, the gossip is that they started their relationship right after D-Day. We live in a no-fault state, so it doesn't matter anyway. Unlike Greg and I, Kate decided to divorce Rich right away. Since the house they were living in was gifted to her, and they apparently had little savings, their divorce was final months before ours. As for Rich, it's a sad story. He was very broken up by the divorce, and on Halloween of last year, he was picked up for a DUI, driving under the influence. That's a bad charge. Apparently, this was the second such violation. Kate used this to get full custody of their daughter, and now he only has supervised visitation, which occurs at Kate's parents' house, as Greg and Kate don't want to see him, and Rich is deathly afraid of Greg. I learned this through gossip. I think it's dirty and cruel for Kate to do this to her child's father, even though she may hate him. But I understand why she did what she did. So on one hand, she's saying, I think it's dirty and cruel for her to do this. But then she says, I understand why she did what she did. I understand why she did what she did. Her husband's a cheater. Her husband's a liar. Her husband has 2 DUIs. Do you really want to trust your daughter with this guy? He's totally unstable. Kate and her daughter are now living with Greg and my kids in my house. Of course, it's no longer my house, but I still think of it that way. This whole situation really depresses me, so I try not to think about it, but still do nearly every minute of the day, she says. I try to convince myself that this whole thing with Kate is just a phase for Greg, just like I went through with Rich. Kate is pretty and young. She's 26. So you can see here, folks, she's very, of course, jealous of this Kate because Kate now has her man. And oh, by the way, Kate is younger by some 5 years. And I'm guessing she's also prettier than the original poster here. So she says she's like a new play toy for Greg. Since they were brought together under stressful circumstances, I don't think their love is genuine. I still hold hope that one day Greg and I will reunite, but I wish him and Kate the best. Does anybody really think she wishes Kate and her husband Greg the best, that their relationship works and flourishes? No, she hopes that they break up so that she can try to swoop back in and get her husband. Last week, I was advised that my contact with Greg will be limited further. As he advised me, we will only be talking about our kids via email starting on Wednesday of this week. Greg said Kate has been communicating with Rich this way, and he wants to do the same. Hearing this broke me even further. I know Kate had to put him up to this, as he would never cut me off like that. See, everything now is Kate's fault. Even though Kate is a victim of your affair, OP, you're treating her like she's a villain. As for me, I've recently been spending most of my time decorating my new apartment and making it a comfortable place for my kids. It's only got 2 bedrooms, so things are a little crowded, but we make it work. I wish I could go back and change the past, but I can't, so now I'm just moving forward one baby step at a time. That's where things are today with me. Thanks for reading this, Gina. So that's her story. And overall, I think the husband handled things up front pretty well. He immediately addressed the situation with his wife. He separated from her legally. He communicated to everyone about the affair, which is a good thing for him to do. And then he immediately divorced her. Now, where I think he made a mistake is when he confronted that affair partner up in that office and he pushed him hard and he ended up flipping out the window. Even though that guy charged at him, you got to be very careful in these kind of situations, because if that guy would have gotten hurt, seriously hurt, or even worse, then he could have been in real hot water with the law there. So that's where I say you got to be very careful and never employ violence. Now, the other place where I think he has made a big mistake is jumping into this relationship with Kate. I see no problem with him dating Kate and having fun with Kate, but jumping into a relationship and now having a child on the way with Kate, I think is a big mistake, because all he's done by doing that is forever cemented the relationship with these four people. He is never now going to get this Rich out of his life, because now remember, Rich has a child with Kate. So there's always going to be a connection there. And his ex-wife is always going to be in his life as well, because he's got children with her. So these four people, these four adults now, whether they want to or not, are going to be part of each other's lives in some respect for a long, long time. And I think that was a big mistake. So I want to hear from you. How do you think he handled this situation? Would you have done something different? Have you ever been in a situation like this? If you have, how have you handled it? I want to hear from you. And hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. Share it with your friends, and please subscribe to this great channel. And I will talk to you on the next one.